Now, normally GIFs are fairly small, but we're actually going to be building a somewhat larger one. More importantly, for this assignment, we're going to be building a looping GIF. And so that means as you start assembling this, make sure that you can either return to the original position or you just move everything off screen and you start with everything off screen. And I'll show you what I mean as we go through, but it's going to have to loop seamlessly. So first things first, we're in our fairly more or less standard Photoshop setup, right? Nothing too fancy. It's just however it was at the end of one of the assignments. So we need to make a new file altogether. And this time, instead of just using our standard custom document type, we're going to come down here and we're going to grab the HD TV size one. And how do we get to that? Well, under film and video, so document type film and video, you'll see that we have HD TV and we have a 1080p. And so that's the resolution on high definition television. It's 1080 pixels. So that's all that's going on there. Keep in mind that's 1080 pixels high. Wide, we actually have 1920. Now the resolution is 72 and that's perfectly fine. You can see in inches, it seems quite large. If you'd like, as long as the pixel size is right, we'll be okay. I'm going to leave everything default. That means an RGB background. We're going to be at 8-bit. We're going to use the white for now. We can always change that later. Yes, please square pixels. If you do decide to color manage the document for whatever reason, please use the sRGB IEC 61966 2.1. Not because that's by any means the best, but just because that's the simplest one, so it should work fine on everything. All right, so we'll leave all of these the default, and you can see I touched something, so it's mad. Let me go back to film and video. All right, we're at our default. I'm going to go ahead and tell it OK. And notice that it produces some of these little guides. And if you hit Control R to bring up your ruler, since Command R on a Macintosh, you'll see that they don't seem to line up to much when it's in inches. I believe if we go to centimeters, there we go. It should line up more or less correctly. What these are is what's considered a safe space on a broadcast television, and this will change according to whatever TV you're designing something for. For example, if you're doing a CR television, the old CR TVs that everybody used to have, the big thick ones, there was a certain space where things would distort past the edges. And so you'd mark things off and you'd say, hey, everything in here for sure will be fine. Everything in this space will be maybe a little distorted, but pretty good. And anything out here, well, good luck. And so if you were placing text, for example, you would need to have it within the smallest range. Now, we don't really need these for anything. So if you want, you can get rid of them and that will be perfectly fine. If you kind of like them and you are thinking about producing something and you want it to show up nicely on standard television, standard HD television, you can leave them in place. But keep in mind, if you start doing something like painting, there will be two ways that these will interact. If you have snap off, then you can paint without any problem, right? But if you have snap on, then when you paint, things will occasionally pop into strange positions. And what do I mean by snap? If we pop on over to, I believe it is view, and you have snap, and you have snap to guides. If you turn off snap, notice when I'm drawing this, it's not trying to pop it like it did over here, pop it right up into the area. It doesn't need to do that because snap's off. So keep that in mind if you're trying to paint with the guides on. Do turn off snap if you don't want it to have weird edges everywhere. All right, so that said, if you want to get rid of the guides, as you know, you can just drag them off. That's perfectly fine. And by drag them off, have the ruler up, and when you drag them up to a ruler, it will disappear. If you want to get rid of all of them at once, we can just go to View and Clear Guides, and that will just clear out all of our guides. Again, you may want to leave them on. If you want to have something that looks a little more authentic for television, just know to put the text on the innermost guide square, and you'll be good to go. Now, that's only half of the equation. We've got the document set. Now, keep in mind, this is very large. And when you produce your GIF, your final GIF, by rendering it out with your Save for Web legacy, and I'll show you all that later, you're going to knock this down in size considerably. This is your working space and this is your working file. It can get kind of big depending on what you're working on. But this is in case you need to do edits later. It's good to work a little bit bigger than what you're saving out to. That way you can hide little errors and mistakes that could crop up over time that you don't notice. As you shrink down, those will just kind of disappear. But like I was saying, this is half of the equation. The other half is actually having your timeline to do video editing on. Now, if you've done video editing before, this will be very familiar, but if you've never done it, essentially the timeline is the way of saying at this second, do this thing, at this next second, do this other thing, at this next second, do something else. It will be pretty apparent as we proceed. One of those self-explanatory things. So let me show you how to get that. If you go to Window and you scroll way down, there's something called Timeline. Now, if you're on a much older version of Photoshop, it used to be called the Animation Palette. And so keep that in mind if you're working for a company that has like a CS3 or 6 or something like that. You may have Animation, which would be up here at the top instead of Timeline. And so in our Creative Cloud versions, we're just going to use Timeline. We'll bring that open. Now, this is where things get a little interesting. We have frame animation and we have video timeline. Notice when we first added this in, it's just empty except for this big button and this drop down. Now, a video timeline is the one that allows us to use keyframes, and we'll get into what keyframes do later. A frame animation allows us to do what you might consider more traditionally hilarious little GIFs. It also is much easier for hand-drawn animation, believe it or not, the frame animation. Well, I say that, but it depends. If you're doing a small cycle that is something a few seconds long, the frame animation is easier. If you're doing something very long, it can be easier to use a video timeline because you have access to more effects. But what are these? Well, let me show you. First, we'll do the one you're not going to start with, just so we could get out of the way. This is the frame animation, and this is as simple as creating additional frames. So let me grab a dot and just paint that in. And then I will move over to the next frame by pressing the new frame button here. And I will move the dot and I will add another frame and I will move the dot and I will add another frame and I will move the dot and I will add another frame and I'll move the dot and I'll add another frame and I'll move the dot. And guess what I'm going to do? Add another frame and I'm going to move the dot and I'm going to add another frame and I'm going to move the dot. But keep in mind at the very beginning of all this, the dot was here. So we're going to want to loop. So I'm going to add another frame. I'm going to move the dot. I'm going to add another frame. I'm going to move the dot. And I'm doing this for two reasons. I don't want it sliding someplace strange. In this case, it doesn't matter because we're doing frame animation. My apologies. The other reason is I want to have a little bit of a gap of white. I'm going to move the dot. And I'm going to add another frame, and I'm going to move the dot. All right, let's see how this plays. That's it. So I have a play button. I can play, and I can stop. I could go back a frame. I could go forward a frame, or as many frames as I want. I can pause things by changing the amount of time that something exists, such as no delay, hence the 0 seconds, or by default up to 10 seconds, or you can do another amount if you so desire. You can have it loop once, 3 times, or forever. And you have some interesting tween animation frames where it will try to guess where things should be between animations. And so if we click it and run, it will say how many. If we add like 2, tell it okay, this will produce a smoother transition. And we can keep doing things like that as we go through. Yeah, it's pretty impressive. So that, and you can also delete frames by pressing delete frames. So by all standards, this method is easier to work with, but it doesn't have as many tools to handle what we're doing. So I'm actually going to switch over from our frame animation to the video timeline animation, and you never get stuck in one of these. You can always click the little button down here and we'll convert to the other one. So in this case, we're in frame animation. So this will convert it to the video animation, the video timeline. So I'll click that and voila, I'm in a video timeline. That said, we seem to still have some form of animation in here. And the reason for that is that it did its best to convert this. And so it did some crazy things. But what are these things? How are these working? What's going on? Well, this has to do with keyframes. And that's what we're going to cover in the next bit. But to clarify things, because we just covered quite a bit, even though it may not seem that way, let me close all of this again. I'm going to go to Windows and hide my timeline. By default, you'll start here. So you're going to go to File and New, and you're going to go to the Film and Video, and you're going to go to HD TV 1080p. And I'm just double checking that that is the size and that I don't have you going to something else. So you should have these defaults, a width of 1920 pixels, a height of 1080 pixels, a resolution of 72. You have RGB color mode at 8-bit, white background, and you can change all this once you've made it, don't worry. Color profile is just going to not manage the document by default. Going to tell it OK. You're going to go to Window and make sure you have your timeline. You're not going to do frame animation unless you absolutely want to, but as you saw, there's not as much to explain. So I'm going to handle, in this case, video timeline. So again, if you want to do some hand-drawn stuff, since this is pretty short, you'll probably want frame animation, but we're not going to cover that right now. We're going to do video timeline. I'll make one of these guys, and I'll talk about like how all this works in just a moment. And if you don't want these guides popping up and causing you any kinds of problems, just go to View and go to Clear Guides. Now's a great time to save your work because you have an empty template. So I'm just going to call this the default naming convention 11 dash last name dash first name. And then in this case, I'm just going to call this 01. And especially in older versions of Photoshop, it's possible that while you're working on the timeline, it will crash out and destroy all of your work. So what you need to do is frequently save, and every so often when you've made a big change, save as, so that you have a file to go back to in case your entire document becomes corrupt due to Photoshop wildly mishandling something. I don't know for sure what version of Creative Cloud you're on, or even if you're in Creative Suite. So I absolutely recommend doing a save as from time to time, just to make sure you have multiple copies. I've seen students lose all of their work because they haven't done that. I hate to see that happen. Please make sure you save a few copies as you go. All right, next video, we'll start dealing with how this whole timeline works when we're in the video timeline. Okay, catch you in the next video.